Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Madi Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, I am super excited because we are about to finish the very first volume of Stars of Chaos, also known as Chapeau Lang by Priest. We're doing the second half of Arc 4, Dragon Threat, and that consists of chapters 32 through 36. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and dig in. Enjoy! Chapter 32, Linyuan. Gu Pengxiao's finger rested on a tiny archipelago in the East Sea. The map wasn't very neatly drawn, and the islands looked like a string of inky blots left by the careless flick of a brush. Guyuan had a map of the entirety of Great Liang stored safely inside his head, but he had no recollection of such a place. The merchants lacked a proper gas lamp, and the oil lamp illuminating the room was too dim. Even with the monocule, it was difficult for him to see anything. He frowned and tried to adjust the oil lamp brighter. "Great Master Liao Zhen gave me this map," said Gu Pengxiao. "I've checked. The Ministry of War's maps don't have this place marked. There are probably some small, uninhabitable islands. This area of the sea is surrounded by turbulent currents and invisible reefs, and the people along the coast have no shortage of ghost stories about these waters. Even the locals don't know there are islands there." This place was a significant distance from the mainland. It was impossible to swim there. You would have to get there either by ship or by flight. But Great Liang's military kites and dragons were both reliant on compasses. If there were disturbances in the celestial poles at these coordinates, no vessel would be able to find this place. What's more, anything further east of here was effectively the territory of Dongying. Great Liang's kites and dragons hovering around the area for no reason would be seen as a hostile provocation. For travel by flight, they left only the hawks. But the maintenance of hawk armor was very demanding and required skilled technicians. Since the upkeep of their equipment was difficult and costly, and since the eastern coast had been at peace for many years, the Hawk Division had no troops stationed here. If it's not even on the Ministry of War's charts, where did Great Master Liao get this map? Chang'eng couldn't help but ask. He said there was a despotic ruler of the previous reign who loved the pearls of the East Sea. Gu Pengxiao earnestly explained. The fishermen, at the end of their rope from the yearly demands for tribute, organized a pearl-collecting suicide squad, which accidentally stumbled across this place. Those very fishermen later drew this map. Gu Pengxiao stared. What a shoddy story Liao Zhen had made up to placate a foolish kid. Gu Pengxiao turned to Gu Yuan and signed. "My lord, what do we do?" Before Gu Yuan could reply, the entire ship shuddered. Gu Yuan grabbed for the oil lamp before it could tip over. With a glance, he signaled Gu Pengxiao to put away everything on the table. Demonstrating his quick wit, Gu Pengxiao puffed out his chest and sucked in his belly, rapidly stuffing all the miscellaneous items back into his lapels. Chang'eng picked up his sword from the table. "I'll go take a look." "Wait, I'm going too," called Gu Pengxiao. The two of them darted out of the room, one after the other. Guyuan removed the glass monocle and set it aside, rubbing his aching eyes. The small string of islands were very subtly placed. It was past the Dongying archipelago, and it also wasn't connected to Great Liang. It lay right across a short stretch of water from Jinan Prefecture. With a good strategy, making an advance on the capital from such a place wasn't out of the question. But no matter how weak Great Liang's navy might be, it wasn't anything that could be defeated by some small foreign nation to the east. No veins of violet gold had been discovered in the East Sea to date, and Great Liang strictly forbid any export of the fuel, like a stingy iron root that wouldn't allow one to pluck a single feather. If Dongying wanted to use violet gold at scale, they'd either have to buy it at high prices from the Westerners or find a way to procure it from Great Liang's black markets. If this violet gold had been purchased from the Westerners, there was no reason for it to have been transported overland through Great Liang. As for the black markets, unless their people had connections among officials, it would be difficult for them to get a foothold. Great Liang's black markets for violet gold, the bane of 3 generations of emperors, were like the corpse of a great centipede that refused to go stiff even after death. As soon as restrictions loosened a bit, they'd flare up again from the ashes. only scarcely needed more than a pinky toe's worth of brains to understand that this couldn't be solely a market between civilian desperados. The shadows of all kinds of factions were slinking behind the scenes. Never mind anyone else. Guyuan's own hands certainly weren't clean. With only that pittance of violet gold the court supplied him every year, he'd be hard-pressed to support a house sparrow, a black dog, and an evening bat, much less the Black Hawk, Black Carapace, and Black Steed divisions. The master of such a large-scale violet gold smuggling operation as this must be no ordinary person. Without warning, someone pushed open the cabin's wooden door. Liao Zhen swept inside like an airy immortal, gave Gu Yuan a casual greeting, and shut the door behind him. Gu Yuan had no choice but to perch his glass monocule back on his nose to receive his guest. He could never understand why Liao Zhen was so confident he wouldn't earn himself a beating. Was it because he thought he had a handsome face? In the chill of Gu Yuan's cold stare, Liao Zhen found a chair and sat down as if he'd received a warm welcome. He scooted up to Gu Yuan and signed, "We'll arrive at the land of the dead by nightfall. At that time, this monk will be at your command." "That's not necessary. What can you even do? I'm in no need of a lamp." Liao Zhen had no retort to that. Gu Yuan sat up a bit straighter, the sharpness in his eyes uninhibited by his lack of vision. "I never would have expected Linyuan to extend its hands into the national temple. Great master, let's drop the sticks and stop beating around the bush. What exactly are you trying to accomplish by getting yourselves involved in this affair?" The smile Liao Zhen used when begging for alms slowly slid off his face, replaced with an eminent monk's sorrowful compassion. "The Linyuan pavilion has no ill intent." Gu Yuan's own smile didn't reach his eyes. "Why else do you think you're still alive?" Legend had it that long ago, during the reign of a foolish and incapable ruler, the court had extorted brutal taxes and bled the people dry. As the dynasty teetered on the verge of decline, the nation's heroes rose to the call. The founding emperor of the current dynasty was able to rise above the muck in large part thanks to the intervention of the mysterious Linyuan pavilion. This Linyuan pavilion was composed of individuals from all walks of life. From nobles and high officials to ordinary working people, it accepted all sorts and attracted countless eccentric talents. After the founding of Great Liang, the first emperor wished to confer official titles upon the Linyuan pavilion in gratitude for their great contribution. But the pavilion master stubbornly refused. This great entity disappeared into the Jianghu, where they remained silent until now. The Linyuan pavilion retreats into obscurity in prosperous times and resurfaces in times of chaos. Everyone calls the Black Hawk Battalion crows, but I think the real crow is your distinguished self. Liao Zhen lowered his eyes like a handsome and benevolent Buddha. "My lord, you knew of my origins, yet you never prevented me from getting close to His Highness." Gu Yuan looked at him in silence. "This monk will make a daring guess that your thoughts and concerns happen to align with ours." The ship steadied, and the flame of the oil lamp on the table flickered. The hostility in Gu Yuan's eyes fell away. He sat by the table with his long hair loose around him and a faint furrow between his brows, all the seriousness and respectability he normally trod underfoot surfacing on his face at once. The two stared at each other, but not a single word was spoken. Their conversation was held in a rapid exchange of gestures, yet that didn't hinder them for a moment. Liao Zhen began. "The violet gold burns too fiercely. We won't be able to douse this flame. No one can. Have you considered your avenue of retreat?" Before Gu Yuan could respond, he continued, "Everyone says the Marquis of Order is a military man who knows nothing but war, a mere blade in the Emperor's hands. That's not what I see. Otherwise, why have you still not married? It couldn't actually be because of my Shushong's curse." Gu Yuan seemed to smile. Deciding he had heard enough from Liao Zhen, he put away his glass monocule and covered his eyes once again with that dark strip of cloth. When it was in place, he signed, "The Gu family has no avenue of retreat. If that day does come, I will simply use my humble self as fuel and become a funeral offering to my grandfather's nation. Oh, and the next time you see that miracle doctor who treated my eyes, please wish him well for me." The moment the first bowl of violet gold was dug out of the earth, the world lost any chance at peace. One day, even the most diligent farmer would lose to the tireless iron puppets roaming up and down the field. Even the most peerless fighter would fall in the face of a heavy armor's cannon powerful enough to wipe out an army of thousands. Every single child of those times would face unprecedented revolution before they might once again find a place of their own, no matter if they were noble or blessed with riches or the lowest of the low. Those who lost in the elevated arena ignited by violet gold would never recover from their defeat. Whether vast nations or the insignificant teeming masses, it was all the same. When the world woke up to this inevitability, an unavoidable era of turmoil would arrive. It was only a matter of time. This was the pulse of the era. Whether one was an unmatched hero, a king, a noble, a general, or a minister, no one had the power to stop it. After Gu Yun said his piece, he quietly stood up and paid Liao Zhan no further attention. He strolled out of the cabin, hands behind his back. What exactly was going on outside that led Liao Zhan to run over and proclaim his loyalties as if they were on the brink of war? The instant he stepped out onto the deck, he detected a strange scent carried on the ocean breeze. It was the smell of something burning. Guyuan stood at the door for several moments, carefully analyzing the scent, before he realized that it was the strange and mild scent that came of burning, adulterated violet gold. The merchant ship was presently winding its way through the shallows surrounding the small islands of the archipelago. Two solemn rows of dragon ships flanked them on both sides, the snow-bright battleships arranged in long lines, each ship fully locked and loaded. The merchant ships and their illicit cargo of violet gold proceeded in single file like unassuming rations carts, weaving between a magnificent army of thousands. Guyuan couldn't see, but he could guess the surrounding situation from the heavy tension in the air. Never mind the paltry handful of Black Hawks he brought with him, even the Jiangnan Navy would fall to such a force. A familiar person approached and silently reached out to touch him. No one but Chang'e did this. Other people either took his arm or not. They didn't perform this complex ritual like Chang'e did. Guyuan felt that Chang'e was always mysteriously on edge around him. He invariably felt the need to start by subtly announcing his presence. Unless Guyuan reached out in return to let him take his arm, Chang'e would follow a step behind him and never close the distance. Inexplicable. Guyuan took the arm Chang'e offered and wondered to himself, why is he so nervous with me? Is there a single father in this world who's kinder to their son than I am? There are maybe 100 big warships here, Chang'e rapidly wrote in his palm. I'm not sure if they're sea dragons. They are, Guyuan replied. I smelled them. There's the scent of violet gold. Chang'e didn't know how to respond to this. Didn't Liao Zhan say humans couldn't smell the scent of violet gold? That only canine inspectors could do it? Guyuan sighed and muttered to himself, not without resentment. It's all because of that disastrous, stingy brother of yours. He couldn't relax unless he sent me all the way to the northwest. Well, now the old tortoise in the lotus pond of his rear garden has cultivated into a spirit and thinks it's time to raise some waves. Serves him right. That evening, Liao Zhan changed into his nighttime camouflage and came to visit Guyuan again. Guyuan was wearing his glass monocle. He could only hear sounds within a half-meter radius around him, and he could barely tell who else was in the room through his one assisted eye. The troops under his control included a mute monk, a fake girl, a chubby little boy, and an expert tantrum thrower of his son, while their opponents included armed and ready sea dragon warships and countless Eastern warriors and private soldiers. But no one was nervous because Guyuan was there. This man alone was as good as an army of thousands of soldiers and horses. Drop the act, Guyuan said to Liao Zhan. Your people must have infiltrated this land of the dead. Or why would you have gone to such great lengths to plan this whole charade? Fess up, we're grasshoppers on the same rope now. Liao Zhan soundlessly mouthed the name of the Buddha, then pulled out his faded sandalwood prayer beads. When Guyuan reached out to take them, he suddenly wrinkled his nose, his unusually sharp sense of smell catching hold of a rancid scent. Guyuan reared back. He made it a rule to never speak politely to monks, so he said bluntly, My heavens, great master! How long has it been since you bathed? Those things have practically acquired a patina. The three teenagers took 3 swift steps back. Chang'e could barely recall what Great Master Liao Ren looked like during their first encounter in the palace. Back then, Liao Ren had shown his sincerity when attending an audience with the emperor, washing himself as clean as a white lotus emerging from the water. Guyuan's expression was cold and his mood was horrible. He was blind and deaf, yet this monk was a mute. He had an extremely keen sense of smell, yet the monk hated to bathe. Indeed, there was no bald donkey in this world who didn't actively antagonize him. Of the 108 Buddhist prayer beads, except for the small spacer beads, every third bead could be twisted open from the middle. Inside was an iron seal, 36 in total, each representing a member of the Linyuan pavilion. Guyuan was silent for a time. Has the Linyuan pavilion turned out in full force? Liao Zhen smiled but said nothing. Chang'e frowned. What is the Linyuan pavilion? Caught off guard by Chang'e's question, Guyuan failed to hear what he said and was only able to guess when he saw Liao Zhen begin to sign at Chang'e. He interpreted them at once. They're a bunch of ominous naysayers who excel at making trouble. Enough with the explanations. How do we contact these people? I'm not sure about the others, signed Liao Zhen, but one of them is working as a musician for the leader of the fleet. We just need to get in touch with her. Guyuan thought to himself, our army on the northwestern front doesn't have any singing cricket, yet this private army has its own musician? Ugh, is there no justice in this world? But the Dongying people are suspicious of us, said Chang'e. I've sensed that noodle man in the vicinity several times. We can't move about as we please. Since Chang'e had taken the lead, Gepeng Xiao also spoke up. My lord, when will our people arrive? Guyuan sat across from them, steady and composed, with the inscrutable mien of the martial god of Great Liang, and heard not a single thing. Liao Zhen hurriedly came to his rescue and signed, We must be patient and wait. Once the Jiangnan Navy makes a move, it will be all too easy to alert our enemies. Guyuan managed to deduce through his gestures that Gepeng Xiao had asked about reinforcements. I can count the Black Hawks I've brought on one hand, he thought to himself. And Yao Jun is a freeloader who sleeps 10 hours a day. Who knows if he'll be of any use? Maybe he can help clean up the battlefield after everything's done and dusted. He interrupted Liao Zhen again and said without an ounce of shame, It's impossible to gather a navy on this scale within a couple of days. I suspect a member of the imperial court is planning a revolt. Cleaning up this worthless trash isn't our goal. It's more important to find the true ringleader. Liao Zhen, who had kind-heartedly covered for Guyuan only to be interrupted twice, smiled good-naturedly as he sat across from him like an unwashed lotus flower. Cao Nyangzi coughed. He didn't speak aloud. Ever since he'd gotten a look at Guyuan's unbound hair in this get-up, he'd been unable to say a word in Guyuan's presence. Thus, the deaf man conveniently got off easy this time. Cao Nyangzi cautiously signed. I could give it a try. Likely because Guyuan knew this kid dwaddled about in lovesick infatuation from dawn to dusk and never paid serious attention to martial training, he resolutely refused. Absolutely not. Keep playing the maid. I can disguise myself as a Dongying person, Cao Nyangzi said. Guyuan raised an eyebrow. I can, Cao Nyangzi hurriedly added. I've even disguised myself as a man before. Guyuan leaned in close and said earnestly, Kid, you are aware you've always been a man, right? Cao Nyangzi's face went red with a foom. Every piece of his soul swiveling about like pendulum weights on strings. He had no mental space whatsoever left to process what Guyuan said. Suddenly, Guyuan was yanked back by a hand on his shoulder. Chang'e wasn't afraid to touch him this time. He stood behind him with a severe look on his face, his gloomy expression practically identical to that pedantic scholar Shan Yi's. Guyuan coughed. He allowed himself to be pulled, then got serious again. It's still a no. You don't know how to speak the Dongying language. Cao Nyangzi opened his mouth and spoke. Everyone present, aside from Guyuan, who couldn't hear it, was astonished. He'd uttered a complicated string of syllables. It contained a few incomprehensible Dongying words, and the rest was a stiff-tongued version of Great Liang's official language. Traveling along Great Liang's coast year after year, the Dongying people on the ship had some proficiency in Chinese, but their accent was strange, and their speech interspersed with words from their native tongue. Cao Nyangzi had picked up a perfect imitation of this pidgin. Cao Nyangzi noticed everyone staring at him and immediately lost his composure, ducking his head to bury his face in his hands. That night, a slender Dongying youth slipped undetected onto the small island. There were plenty of Dongying people here, and it was dark out, so no one noticed him. He shuddered at the sight of the rows and rows of dragon in the fleet anchored just offshore. Tamping down his anxiety, he took off at a run. Meanwhile, an uninvited guest appeared at Gu Yun's door. Chang'e opened the door a crack and spotted Jai Song standing outside with a smile. "The general heard our ship is honored with the presence of a fragrance master. I've been instructed to invite you to a banquet." Chapter 33. Hence. "Please wait a moment," Chang'e replied coolly. With no change in expression, he slammed the door shut. He took a deep breath to center himself before turning to Gu Yuan and signing, "Yifu, the rebellion leader wants to see you. What do we do?" Gu Pengxiao's heart was pounding in his chest. He unconsciously held his breath, his face quickly turning the color of an eggplant. Gu Yuan's reaction was very peculiar. After a brief moment of surprise, he began to smile. It was the smile of someone who held the key to victory in his hand, of one who shared a crucial secret with someone else. "Would you look at that? Someone has brought me a pillow just as I was getting drowsy," said the Marquis of Order, who reveled in chaos. "It's been years since I've seen a rebel leader in the flesh." Gullible and unguarded as he was, Gu Pengxiao relaxed when he saw Gu Yuan's flippant attitude, as if they weren't going to see a rebel leader, but some rare treasure. Chang'e, however, refused to swallow his nonsense. His mouth was drawn tight, the piled-up worries from the past few days appearing on his face all at once. He silently signed, "Where are the Jiangnan Army and the Black Iron Battalion?" Even someone as blind as Gu Yuan could see the pallor of Chang'e's face. Chang'e didn't know exactly what the Linyuan pavilion was, but everyone knew about Marshal Gu's grudge against the National Temple. If Gu Yuan had anyone else he could use, why would he bring Liao Zhen, who grated endlessly on his nerves? Yan Hui had been different. He had been carrying the Emperor's secret decree and had every right to summon soldiers to his command. This time, Gu Yuan had clearly abandoned his post and run off to Jiangnan. It was already impressive that he'd brought along a few Black Hawk guards. How could he possibly call for reinforcements? And earlier, why had Gu Yuan paused each time before he spoke, only to rudely interrupt Liao Zhen's every sentence? It was like he was targeting the monk. Even if Gu Yuan behaved rather despicably in private, he wouldn't create this sort of friction for no good reason while engaged in serious business. A fearsome notion flashed through Chang'e's head. Could it be that Gu Yuan wasn't pretending? Could he really not hear them speak and only deduced what they said from Liao Zhen's signed response? The idea was preposterous, but once the thought occurred to him, numerous oddities from the past few days surfaced in his mind. First, Gu Yuan was not a quiet person, but since he'd boarded the ship, whether the two of them were alone together or with a group, Gu Yuan never spoke to him aloud. All their necessary communication had been through sign language. Had the Dongying people really kept such careful watch the whole time? Second, why con his way onto the ship as a fragrance expert? And there were plenty of lower-level fragrance experts around. So why did Gu Yuan insist on disguising himself as a fragrance master? Not only did this provide no benefits, it presented quite a number of difficulties. It was too easy for him to expose himself, and Chang'e held no illusions that Gu Yuan was simply keen to improve his acting skills. Third, a minute detail. Why did Liao Zhen not once knock before entering Gu Yuan's room? Was the monk truly so brave and careless of etiquette? Or did he know there was no point in knocking? Chang'e ought to have noticed these things long ago, but Marshal Gu, long accustomed to wielding military power, carried an inexplicable aura about him. One somehow felt he had everything under control, and everyone needed to only obey his orders. Clouded by this blind belief, one unconsciously overlooked anything unnatural. Noticing the strangeness of Chang'e's expression, Gu Pengxiao looked back and forth in confusion. Outside, Jai Song knocked lightly again and raised his voice to call through the door. "The general is waiting, if Jiang Xiansheng could make haste." Gu Yuan patted Chang'eng on the shoulder, leaned in close to his ear, and whispered, "The Black Iron Battalion is here. Don't be afraid." He took out the strip of black cloth he used as a blindfold and handed it to Chang'eng, signaling for him to help tie it in place. Chang'eng accepted the bit of fabric, expression unreadable, then lifted it to cover Gu Yuan's eyes. While Gu Yuan couldn't see him, Chang'eng shook his head at Genpang Xiao. The younger boy was still wondering what he meant when Chang'eng said mildly in his direction, "Yifu, if you keep going on like this, I'm disowning you." Genpang Xiao's eyes went wide. "Huh?" With a smile tugging up the corner of his lips, Gu Yuan waved in Genpang Xiao's direction. "Cut the chatter, you two. Come along and don't leave my side. You might as well gain some experience since you're here." Genpang Xiao was flummoxed by this completely nonsensical conversation, but Chang'eng felt his heart sink. Gu Yuan really couldn't hear. He had merely used some method to deduce that he and Genpang Xiao were speaking. Then, were his eyes also... But they were clearly fine just a few days ago. Before he could consider the matter any further, Gu Yuan had already taken the lead and stepped out the door. Chang'eng's heart missed a beat. He was near panic as he chased after Gu Yuan to take his arm. He had no time for embarrassment or awkwardness. He nervously grabbed Gu Yuan's arm in one hand and wound his other around the man's body, heart palpitating in fear as he escorted him in a half embrace. Gu Yuan thought this unforeseen summons had made Chang'eng uneasy, so he blithely reached over to pat Chang'eng's arm. After all the half-lies Gu Yuan had deployed against even his own people, Chang'eng could no longer tell if his young godfather was truly careless or only putting on a show of bravado. He could only follow along, his heart tripping circles in his chest. "Zhang Xiansheng, this way, please," Jai Song said with a smile. Taking note of Chang'eng and Genpang Xiao beside Gu Yuan, he asked, "Great Master and the young lady aren't here?" "The young lady is having a hard time adjusting to the conditions of the voyage, so the Great Master will stay behind to take care of her." Chang'eng shot a look at Jai Song. Though his full attention was locked on Gu Yuan, he spared a little piece to offer Jai Song a smile like hidden needles wrapped in cotton wool. "Why do you ask? Does the general want all of us present for his inspection?" "Young master, we would never," said Jai Song politely. These were originally deserted islands, scattered in the East Sea like sheep droppings. The largest was still small enough that someone could probably walk its perimeter in a day. The smaller ones had only an acre or so of land, and each was surrounded by docked sea dragons. Swaying iron gangways exuding puffs of white steam connected the fleet in an extensive net. From a distance, it looked like a city suspended above the ocean. As they walked, Chang'eng noted all the things he saw in Gu Yuan's palm. At the same time, the young man couldn't help but wonder. These islands were in an obscure location, and it would indeed be difficult to discover violet gold was being smuggled here. But seeing the scale of this place, these people had practically constructed a copy of the immortal island of Penglai. Was the Jiangnan Navy dead? Or had the Jiangnan Navy been infiltrated by these people from the beginning? All sorts of wild guesses were floating through his brain when Jai Song suddenly stopped in his tracks. A troop of women dressed as dancers swept across their path on graceful, feather-light steps. Their feet seemed hardly to touch the ground as they crossed the swaying gangway, looking like a crowd of celestial maidens amid the swirling white steam. A woman in white led the procession with a pipa in her arms. When she saw Jai Song crossing her path, she came to a stop and dipped a curtsy. She wasn't especially pretty, her features so plain and unremarkable it was as if they were covered in a layer of gauze. Though she was pleasant enough to look at, there wasn't a single eye-catching thing about her. As soon as she turned away, it became difficult to remember what she looked like. "Ahem, I couldn't possibly," Jai Song demurred. "Please go ahead, Miss Chun. Don't keep the general waiting." The woman nodded in acknowledgement and curtsied again with her pipa in hand. As she floated away, the scent of pacifying incense drifted in her wake. Chang'eng saw the corner of Gu Yuan's mouth tilt up in a slight smile. Still in disguise as a young Dongying man, Cao Nyangzi had run all the way to an unremarkable little boat whose guard was asleep. He held an iron rod behind his back as he approached. Cao Nyangzi was small and slender, more light-footed than the average person. The guard showed no sign of waking when he got close. In the light of the moon over the sea, Cao Nyangza took a good look at that slack-jawed, snoring man. Seeing the drool leaking down his neck, Cao Nyangza was put at ease. Ugh, how ugly! The boat rocked on a gentle wave, and the guard turned in his sleep, nearly falling off his wooden chair. He woke, smacking his lips, only to discover there was someone standing next to him. The guard sat up straight and saw that the person in front of him was an androgynous Dongying youth who greeted him crisply in the Dongying tongue. The man relaxed at once. He rubbed his eyes to get a better look at the person in front of him. But before he could, Cao Nyangza swung the rod straight down on the back of his head. The guard collapsed without so much as a whimper. His assailant patted his own chest and babbled, "This is so scary, so scary." Though he looked frightened to death, Cao Nyangza's nimble hands did not hesitate to retrieve a ring of keys from the guard's waist before turning and darting into the cabin. It was just as that person had described. This was the brig, with 20 or 30 people who seemed to be mechanics locked inside. The moment Cao Nyangza peered in, the people within cried out like birds startled by the twang of a bow. "A Woko pirate! Shh!" Speaking in a hushed voice, Cao Nyangza crowned himself with a great big title. "I'm not a person of Dongying. I am an ally of the Marquis of Anding, Marshal Gu. We've come to put down the revolt. Let's get you all freed first." As the night deepened, a thin layer of fog roiled above the glimmering waves. Liao Zhen and an agile figure in black darted into the ship's cabin, in which several dozen suits of steel armor were laid out in neat rows. Liao Zhen retrieved a bottle from inside his bag, then turned and tossed it to his companion. After a quick look at each other, the two began spraying squid ink onto the steel armor together. Jaisong led Gu Yuan and the others onto an unassuming-looking sea dragon. Before they reached the end of the gangway, they could already hear laughter and music coming from inside the ship's cabin. It happened the moment Jaisong set foot on the deck. A familiar roar came from the corner, and with an explosion of white steam, an iron puppet charged from its hiding place in the darkness and swung its sword at Gu Yuan. Even Jaisong was caught off guard and yelped in fear, falling back on his rear end. Changgong's hand reflexively flew to his sword, but before he could draw it, someone shoved his hand down, slamming the blade back into its sheath. In the next moment, the weight of his arms disappeared as Gu Yuan, still deaf and blind, flipped bodily over the iron puppet's sword. His movements were almost lazy as he lightly tapped his instep on the monster's shoulder. The snow-bright gleam of the iron puppet's sword cast a long streak of illumination across his face. Changgong's pupils contracted. Wasn't he deaf? Weren't his eyes covered? The glare of the blade swept past in an instant, and in the next, Gu Yuan had disappeared behind the iron puppet. Screams erupted in the night, then ceased just as quickly. Jaisong gave a violent shiver. The attacking iron puppet froze mid-swing, and the body of a Dongying man was tossed onto the deck. Gu Yuan's robes whipped back and forth in the ocean breeze as he stood on the deck and pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his hands. He lifted his head slightly and carelessly extended a hand as if there were no one else present. Changgong's throat bobbed, his heart pounding like a drum as he took Gu Yuan's arm. Gu Yuan spoke aloud. "If this is the general's so-called sincerity, we needn't have bothered to come in the first place." Jaisong wiped the sweat from his cheek and opened his mouth to say something, but Gu Yuan cut him off. "No need to explain," Gu Yuan said airily. "I'm deaf. I can't hear you." He turned to leave, but before he could, the cabin door, behind which the sounds of song and dance still echoed, slammed open, and 2 rows of soldiers streamed out, forming a path between them. Changgong looked back toward the cabin and saw a beardless middle-aged man with a pale face. Eyes fixed on Gu Yuan's back, he called out, "Zhang Xianxiang, please wait!" Gu Yuan ignored him. Changgong wrote in his palm, "The ringleader has come out." "Son, there's no way that's the ringleader," Gu Yuan thought. The man stood and made a bow with his hands cupped before him. "Zhang Xianxiang's reputation precedes him. That wretched emperor has in his possession such a talent, yet fails to put you to good use. It truly shows his days are numbered." Gu Pangxiao was more and more confused the longer he listened. Isn't Zhang Xianxiang some random fake name the Marquis made up? What reputation? This flattery is way too insincere. Dropping the aloof act, Gu Yuan tilted his head and asked Chang'eng, "What did he say?" "He said your reputation precedes you and the emperor is courting death by not using you properly," Chang'eng summarized. In these few moments, he had put the pieces together. Of course, Gu Yuan had boarded the ship in the guise of a fragrance expert. The fragrance expert was like the sailors and the Dongying guards. Though members of the same faction, they were just minor underlings. Why would the ringleader call for him by name? Either his real identity had been exposed, or that Monk's people had used some method to manufacture a false identity for Gu Yuan. Chang'eng recalled Gu Yuan's brief summary and ensuing smile when he heard the ringleader wanted to see him. His heart began to sour. So his godfather had known since then? After a year of separation, he no longer needed to look up at Gu Yuan. He even felt that, without his armor, he could pull Gu Yuan into his embrace with a single arm. But that sense of a distance he would never be able to cross rose once again in the young man's heart. Gu Yuan didn't turn back, but gave a composed nod. "This humble one is not familiar with Zhang Xiansheng and saw that you cannot see or hear," the middle-aged man said with his hands cupped in greeting. "Although this humble one did receive letters of recommendation, it is thanks to these Dongying barbarians' lack of manners that I have now witnessed your expert abilities. Aha! My eyes have been opened. Qingshu, pour some wine for Zhang Xiansheng and offer him my apologies." Chang'eng gave Gu Yuan a brief summary of the man's vacuous ramblings. Before he finished writing, he saw a figure inside the banquet room rise. It was the white-clothed woman they had seen on their way here. She expressionlessly poured a bowl of wine, not a cup, but a bowl. The woman walked over steadily and spoke not a word as she held the bowl up to Gu Yuan. The scent of pacifying incense they had noticed earlier wafted over on the ocean winds. Although she was an entertainer, there was no coquettish cast to her face or manner, but rather an aloof coldness. Gu Yuan accepted the wine from the woman's hands and sniffed at it. A faint smile replaced his cool indifference, and he quietly gave his thanks. Chang'eng had no chance to stop him before he lifted the bowl and drained the contents. The woman lowered her eyes politely and bowed before retreating off to the side. The middle-aged man laughed. "How direct of Zhang Xiansheng! I like straightforward people like you." In a panic, Chang'eng scrawled in his palm, "Aren't you afraid it's poisoned?" Gu Yuan thought that was what the unworldly ringleader had asked, and confidently replied, "If you wanted to poison a blind and deaf fragrance master, you would have to take some pains to find an odorless poison." Chang'eng was speechless. Fortunately, Gu Yuan's attitude was overly arrogant in the first place, and although the words seemed a bit blunt, they weren't glaringly out of place. Yet, now Chang'eng was even more certain that Gu Yuan really couldn't hear and wasn't pretending at all. "Please take a seat," said the middle-aged man. Chang'eng didn't dare mess around this time and faithfully conveyed his words to Gu Yuan as spoken. Their group proceeded into the cabin, where the aloof woman began to play a piece on her pipa. "It is our good fortune that the foolish ruler has failed to live up to the virtues of his position and thus allowed us to gather the nation's heroes," the middle-aged man said. "It is truly the most fortunate occurrence of my life." Gu Yuan laughed coldly. "I, however, don't find it at all fortunate to find myself stuck in a room with a bunch of Woku pirates." His every word was barred, but his taunts somehow reinforced his image as a transcendent talent. The middle-aged man was unfazed, clearly prepared to subject himself to all the eccentrics of the nation in the interests of executing his revolt. He said with a smile, "Those who accomplish great things don't get hung up on trifles." Xianshang's words display a bias. Ever since Emperor Wu opened up maritime trade, how many foreign goods have made their way into our great Liang? Even the farming puppets recently deployed in Jiangnan have foreign antecedents. As long as they're capable, what does it matter if they're foreigners from the east or west? He quickly warmed to his subject, bemoaning the state of the world and enumerating countless cases of abuse of power and systemic problems since the start of the Yuanhe reign. Chang'eng and Ge Pengxiao's usual conversation partners were either that mysterious monk from the National Temple or the great scholar the Marquis estate had hired at a high price in gold. They found this logical-sounding explanation quite refreshing. Not a single word of it would stand up to scrutiny. The man was confidently spitting out rubbish while having no idea what he was talking about. Guyuan stopped speaking and only sneered. Within the time it took to burn a stick of incense, he seemed to lose patience and cut off the man's speech. I came here with the sincere intention to join your cause, yet the Lord has found a talking puppet to waste my time. How very disheartening. A spasm crossed that middle-aged man's face. Without another word, Guyuan pulled Chang'eng to his feet. In that case, we'll be taking our leave. Wait! Zhang Xiansheng, wait! The man called out. Guyuan ignored him. But before he could take a step, the guards at the door split down the middle, and a tall, thin man in a long cloak strode in. Zhang Xiansheng, am I qualified to speak with you? He asked in a ringing voice. The middle-aged man trotted over to the tall and thin man's side and said to Guyuan, This is our Huang Qiao, Commander Huang. He is a crucial figure here, so he had to verify your identity. Please take no offense. Chang'eng frowned. He found the name Huang Qiao slightly familiar and was about to relay the whole message in Guyuan's palm, but Guyuan lightly squeezed his fingers, stopping him. Guyuan, who was still deaf as anything a few moments ago, somehow managed to hear the man's words with his own ears. Commander Huang, said Guyuan in a low voice, Commander-in-Chief of the Jiangnan Army and Navy. Lower second rank. I am well and truly surprised. As he spoke, he slowly removed that slip of black cloth. His uncovered eyes shone like the morning star rising in the east. How could anyone think he was blind? He tugged his arm out of Chang'eng's grip and waved off the worried young man with a roguish smile. Hey, Commander Huang, when I served at old General Du's side, were you still an assistant regional commander? It's been so long. Do you still remember me? Chapter 34. Truth and Lies. The door of the iron cage clicked open with the 6-key Cao Nyangzi tried. Quick, everyone out! The prisoners inside had turned into startled birds, all shrinking back in fear at the sight of the rod in his hands. An old man in his 60s appeared to be the leader among them. He offered a trembling bow and said, Young General, we are merely a group of artificers captured by the rebel army. We're not part of their rebellion. You must tell that to Marquis Gu in your report. Cao Nyangzi swiftly strapped the iron rod to his back and said, The Marquis knows everything. There's just one task with which we could use your assistance. On this unremarkable little ship, a bunch of barefooted and battered artificers poured out of the jail cell, supporting each other as they walked. Every one of them jumped into the ocean and swam off in a different direction. The trembling of the deck under their footsteps woke the guard, who arose with a series of groans, only to get another strike to the face. After completing his task, Cao Nyangzi looked down at this guard, hands on his hips. He found it unbelievable. When beautiful men fainted, they looked perfectly pitiful, like the collapse of a jade mountain. Such a sight inspired tender feelings of affection. So why was it that when ugly men fainted, their eyes all rolled up into their skulls like this? He shook his head and muttered to himself, Incomprehensible. Holding his nose, Cao Nyangzi dragged the man into the jail cell and locked it with a clink. Job done. He, too, made his escape. On the flagship of the fleet, Guyuan stood with his hands behind his back and a look of perfect composure on his face. Despite having only 2 young subordinates at his side, he gazed at the armed and armored soldiers before him with an assured half-smile. Anyone might fail to recognize a person they had last seen as a teenager of 15 or 16 at first glance, even more so after years on the battlefield had so completely transformed their disposition. But as long as the individual in question hadn't suffered any major disfigurement, their features wouldn't have changed much, even after all this time. At Guyuan's words, a look of shock came over Huang Qiao's face. He looked carefully at him for a while, then sucked in a sharp breath and took a step back. You are... Guyuan gripped a Dongying katana he had snatched in the earlier scuffle and casually tested its balance. He used the discarded blindfold to tie up his loose hair, then said with a smile, What a surprise. It looks like Commander Huang has recognized me after all. The dignified bearing with which Huang Qiao had offered enlistment to the talents of the world disappeared in a flash as he began to tremble uncontrollably like he'd been cursed. Guyuan replied, It's Gu Yun. 好久不见. Long time no see. Before he finished speaking, one of the soldiers lost his grip on his weapon in fright, and it dropped to the floor with a clang. The cabin was silent except for the white cloth people player in the corner, who played without a single missed note as if she'd heard nothing at all. The melody of the Jiangnan tune, Song of Homebound Fishermen, seemed rather incongruous with this sort of atmosphere. Impossible! The middle-aged man who had been so confidently spouting nonsense only moments ago blurted out. The Marquis of Anding is in the northwest suppressing raiders. How could... If you're going to rebel, you should read some more books. Gu Yuan looked at him and offered some earnest advice. The EC doesn't have the budget to maintain hawks, but you must have at least heard of them before. Outside the cabin, a series of screams pierced the night air. Someone swung a lantern around to illuminate the area, only to see several black shadows flash across the deck like ghosts. They alighted, then darted away, slaying a person each time they touched down, like plucking feathers from a passing goose. Black Hawks! It's the Black Hawks! Impossible! Shut your mouth! Huang Qiao shouted. How could the Black Iron Battalion be in the EC? How could the Marquis of Anding be here? Arrows! Shoot these impostors down with Parhelion arrows! Sir, look out! The Black Hawks swept overhead, loosing arrows like rain. The rebel fighters on the deck covered their heads and darted about like rats as the scene descended into chaos. The people player in the corner remained unmoving. She plucked at her strings and adeptly switched the tune to Ambush from All Sides, quite befitting of the scene. Huang Chao's eyes nearly bugged out of his head. So what if Gu Yuan is here? I refuse to believe he could have brought the Black Iron Battalion all the way from the desert. Cut him down, and let's see who else that wretched emperor has to rely on. Attack! The soldiers unsheathed their weapons and glared balefully at the three figures encircled in their midst. Gunpang Xiao flinched and furtively tugged on Changgeng's arm. Under the cover of the music, he whispered, "Dake, they're right. What do we do?" Before Changgeng could reply, Gu Yuan rapped his knuckles on Gunpang Xiao's forehead through the scattered hair that had fallen across it, smiled broadly, and said, "That's right. I only have these few Black Hawk guards at my side." "Well said, Commander Huang. You have both courage and insight." Gunpang Xiao blinked. "Dake, that's not right. The Marquis is quite confident." Changgeng said nothing. Brandishing their weapons, the rows of soldiers shuffled back and forth like a human wave, rising and falling like the tide. But not one of them dared advance. Gunpang Xiao was woozy with confusion. Does the Marquis have backup or not? Though Changgeng wasn't so conceited as to call himself smart, he usually did think a bit more than Gunpang Xiao. But now he found himself just as confused. Is he deaf or not? The incomprehensible Marshal Gu strode toward Huang Qiao with a labyrinthine smile, completely ignoring the dithering soldiers surrounding him. If I recall correctly, Commander Huang was taught by Chuang Zhilu, the maternal uncle of Prince Wei. When the late emperor passed, Prince Wei fell to take command of the Imperial Guard. So what? Now he's trying to take a naval route? In a flash, Changgeng recalled that when Gu Yuan escorted him back to the capital back then, he had dragged nearly half the Black Iron Battalion along with him. He left the troops right outside the walls, swords pointed at the capital. And when they hurried to the palace, they had seen Prince Wei and the Crown Prince, now the Emperor, kneeling outside the late Emperor's chambers. Gu Yuan had even stopped to greet them, thinking on it now, that had indeed been quite the meaningful greeting. So Prince Wei had been planning a coup, but only stopped because Gu Yuan rushed back to the capital? Gu Yuan's words were like a bolt of lightning to Huang Qiao, who had once thought all his plots had been exposed. How had the emperor noticed Prince Wei's intentions? Had they slipped up in the capital? Or had one of their own here in the Liangjiang area turned traitor? But these questions no longer mattered. He only knew that Gu Yuan was here, and he was dead. Never would it have occurred to Huang Qiao that Gu Yuan was only making wild guesses based on vague knowledge of the mentorship affiliations among the military generals of the imperial court. Gunpang Xiao was stupefied. What? The Marquis knew Prince Wei was planning a revolt? Changgeng's hand came to rest on his sword. Knowing his own death was near, Huang Qiao threw caution to the wind. Fury swirled in his gut, and he roared and launched himself at Guyuan with murder in his eyes. In the corners of the room, a few iron puppets that had originally been set up as decorations let out furious bellows and raised their weapons. Chang'e leapt out from behind Guyuan and blocked Huang Chao's sword before Guyuan could react. "Commander," he said grimly, "I'd appreciate a demonstration of your skills." Their master had led the charge, so the underlings behind him had no more excuses to retreat. No matter how frightened they were, they charged forward in a single rush, pouring into the tiny cabin. Gu Pengxiao groped around in his clothing, but found nothing he could use to protect himself. So he scrambled behind Guyuan. Guyuan held the Dongying sword horizontally across his chest and flicked away a strike aimed at him with a sweep of a narrow blade. He grinned. Shh, do you hear that? He had perfected the skill of acting mysterious to an even greater degree than the skills of the battlefield. No one could resist the urge to prick up their ears and listen. Chang'e's sword dragged across Huang Chao's blade with a piercing screech. Without warning, the young man expressionlessly kicked out and struck Huang Chao in the waist. The man howled and collapsed against the foot of an iron puppet who, having no concept of friend or foe, chopped at everyone it saw. Huang Chao cut a sorry figure scrambling around as he attempted to avoid its strikes. The plucking of strings echoed through the cabin. Who knew what that woman was thinking? But she now switched from ambush on all sides to Phoenix's courtship song. Everyone could hear the quiet roar of the waves and the whoosh of black hawks swooping overhead. Gradually, everyone's faces transformed as a new sound swelled in the dark. They heard battle cries, whistles, and the sound of drums, as if an army of thousands had surrounded them from all sides. Huang Chao was frozen in shock. He couldn't help but recall the hair-raising rumors about the Black Iron Battalion past the northern border, as the sky was darkened by snowstorms and sheep and wolves alike trembled on the endless, oppressive plains. An army of wraith-like soldiers arrived on the gale winds in iron armor as dark as crow feathers, white smoke roiling in their wake. When they broke through the winds, even gods and ghosts would shrink in fear. The lights on the deck of the large fleet of sea dragons began to go dark one by one. The rumbling of the ship's engines went silent as their propulsion was cut, as if some invisible beast was swallowing down these helpless sea dragons in the darkness. The soldiers and Dongying fighters fell into disarray. Suddenly, an enormous firework erupted above the fleet, lighting up half the sky. Some sharp-eyed person cried out in fear, "Ah, the Black Iron Battalion!" In the fading light of the fireworks, the men on the deck saw that a contingent of warriors in pitch-black heavy armor had already boarded the flagship. The one in the lead turned, his eyes like flashes of lightning. Inside the cabin, Chang'e swiftly pressed forward and swung down at Huang Chao from above. Gu Pengxiao's eyes swiveled. He pulled out an iron sphere the size of a large pill from his lapels and tossed it at Huang Chao's feet. "Da Ge, I'll lend you a hand." The iron sphere seemed to gain speed on its own as it shot toward Huang Chao. Commander Huang immediately lost his footing. He managed to fend off only a few strikes before Chang'e's sword struck him hard on the wrist and he collapsed to the floor with a cry. That little iron sphere, meanwhile, flew out from the crowd, bounced from the deck, roared upward, and exploded in mid-air with a final flourish. Chang'e swung his arm back and embedded his sheath in the chest of an oncoming iron puppet. He gave a final twist and a push. The iron puppet creaked a few times, then fell still. "Yifu," he called out, "the ringleader has been apprehended." Guyuan laughed. "The real ringleader remains in the imperial court." He turned and walked toward the cabin door as if the soldiers and puppets still in the room did not exist. Astonishingly, no one dared to stop him. Black Hawk circled over the deck. Guyuan produced a palm-sized iron token from his lapels and tossed it into the air. One of the Black Hawks deftly caught it and alighted on the mast high above. Commandeering the sea dragon's copper squall, the soldier called in a clear voice, "The rebel leader has been apprehended. The Black Iron Tiger tally is here. If any soldiers of the Jiangnan Navy see this token and turn to the light, past misdeeds will be forgiven. Anyone who fails to heed this call will be executed on the spot. The Black Iron Tiger Tally was given to the Marquis of Anding by Emperor Wu. In times of emergency, it represented the authority to command the 8 branches of the military. There were 3 tallies in total. Gu Yuan held one, the court kept hold of another, and the emperor held the third. The 30-some imprisoned artificers had swum up and cut the propulsion system of over half the sea dragons from the water, and the lines of communication had collapsed. The majority of the rebel army was made up of the Navy sailors Huang Qiao had brought with him, while the smaller part were miscellaneous troops recruited elsewhere. When the rebel soldiers heard the Black Hawk's proclamation, they roiled like a boiling pot. Some put up a stubborn resistance while others turned their coats on the spot. Even more were simply bewildered. The terrified Dongying people turned on their own comrades, and the rebel troops began fighting with their own for no good reason. Lights blazed on the flagship as Chang'e pushed Huang Qiao out before him, fully trussed up. Seeing that the tide had turned, the rebel soldiers on the flagship threw down their weapons one after another. That insouciant musician inside the cabin was still playing. She had by this time performed an untold number of songs, each played in perfect tune. Gu Yuan's face was calm as a still pond in the faint light. Chang'e stared at him in confusion. He figured Gu Yuan must have encountered plenty of situations like this, but he still wondered where that Black Iron army had materialized from. It was easy to hide a couple of Black Hawks, but a whole army? And how had he brought the Black Iron army all the way from the northwestern desert? And finally, was he pretending to be deaf or pretending not to be deaf? Standing there on the deck, even Chang'e couldn't help but think Gu Yuan must have known Prince Wei would rebel a long time ago, and that he had set his sights on the East Sea Navy and lain in wait till they had all their ships and armaments prepared, ready to take them out in one incisive strike. A familiar rumbling could be heard in the distance. Yao Zhen had finally mobilized the Jiangnan Navy, and their giant dragons took to the sea. The silhouette of a giant kite already loomed in midair. Gu Yuan communicated with the Black Hawks in the sky through simple hand signals. At his orders, one of them sped off to the giant kite with the Black Iron Tiger Tally in hand to take command of the navy Yao Zhen had dispatched. Huang Qiao squeezed his eyes shut. It was over. The unceasing music finally stopped. Holding her pipa, the white-cloth musician unhurriedly strolled out from the cabin and glanced down at the tied-up Huang Qiao. Huang Qiao glared at her and rasped out, "Chen Qingxu, even you will betray me now?" Chen Qingxu gave him a bemused look, then swept coolly past him. Her face was like a painted mask. She was expressionless when offering wine, expressionless when playing the pipa, expressionless when listening to the sounds of slaughter, expressionless when enduring the interrogation of others. She strolled up to Gu Yuan. "Marquis?" Gu Yuan promptly dropped his arrogant attitude. "Many thanks for your assistance, miss. I don't know if you and old Chen Zhuo Xianxiang are—" Chen Zhuo was the miracle doctor who had prescribed Gu Yuan his medicine many years ago. "He is my grandfather," Chen Qingxu said, then added pointedly, "The winds are high on the ocean. You had best go sit inside the cabin." Gu Yuan knew she was reminding him about the headaches that came as a side effect of the medicine. He gave her a wan smile, but said nothing. Seeing that he had rejected her advice, Chen Xingqiu wasted no more words, but merely curtsied and said, "May the world prosper in peace, and may all here today enjoy long and healthy lives." "Many thanks," said Gu Yuan again. Chen Xingqiu turned to disembark from the boat. Perhaps she was tired after her performance, but she didn't even spare a glance for the rebel army embroiled in battle around her. Good Peng Xiao watched her go. They're all tangled up with each other in a fight at the end of the gangway. Why did that Jie just leave like that?" Gu Yuan frowned and was about to call out to her when a Dongying warrior charged out onto the gangway and opened his mouth to blow a hidden dart at her. From mid-air, a Black Hawk immediately knocked an arrow and took aim, and the Dongying man dropped into the ocean. Chun Xingqu stepped lightly to the side as if she was dancing along to the rhythm of the swaying gangway, and the Dongying dart narrowly brushed past her body, burying itself into the iron gangway with a cling. She didn't even look up as she floated away like a fluttering ghost in white. Gepeng Xiao blinked. Sure enough, every weirdo in this nation belonged to the Linyuan pavilion. By the time the giant kite and dragons arrived on the scene, the rebel army had already made quite a mess of themselves. The Black Hawks escorted their prisoners from the flagship, and the regular army began mopping up the rest. In the midst of all this, a black carapace soldier charged into the flagship and flipped up his visor. Chang'e was shocked to discover that this person was Liao Zhen. Great Master Liao Zhen was clearly even less familiar with heavy armor than the barbarians who had attacked Yanhui town. Though mechanical augmentation provided him with incredible strength, he wove back and forth, and he walked and couldn't control his limbs properly as he ran, moving in fits and starts like a valiant but clumsy rabbit. He barely kept his balance by grabbing on to the railing and nearly fell to his knees. Upon closer inspection, the black carapace he was wearing was shedding its color to reveal ghostly pale metal beneath, and he was shrouded in a bewitching fishy scent. So this was the Black Iron Battalion that had scared the rebel armies out of their wits. Then where had all the battle cries come from? Ventriloquist stunts? Chang'e silently ground his teeth. He felt like Gu Yuan had tricked him once again. Liao Zhen raised his two mechanical arms with difficulty and attempted to sign, but his control was too poor and he couldn't manage to separate his fingers. He swayed like a strand of seaweed, but no one could understand what he was saying. He gestured around until his forehead was covered in sweat, struggling inside his heavy armor. Staring blankly, Gepeng Xiao observed, "My lord, the Great Master seems to have some urgent report." Gu Yuan turned to look. "It's nothing. That idiot can't get out. Go help him take the armor off." Gepeng Xiao didn't know what to say. Stuck inside the heavy armor, the monk stared innocently back at him. Gepeng Xiao sucked in a breath. "Great Master, aren't you an expert in all sorts of steel armors and engines?" The monk couldn't speak and couldn't sign, so he could only use his unusually lively eyes to express his meaning. "Expert doesn't mean I know how to wear them. I'm a monk, not a soldier." Gepeng Xiao ended up having to manually remove the heavy armor from the outside with Chang'e's help. Liao Zhen tumbled out and didn't spare even a second to neaten himself up before walking over to Gu Yuan and signing with a serious countenance. "Marshal, the Jiangnan Navy has arrived. Commissioner Yao is on the kite. No matter what, you ought to go inside to rest." Chang'e started, sensing some meaning hidden within these words. His head whipped around to look at Gu Yuan, who was still perfectly poised as if nothing was the matter. Gu Yuan didn't remain stubborn this time, but made a brief sound of assent and turned back to the cabin, still playing with his stolen Dongying sword. Chang'e hurried after him. At that moment, the snake-like Dongying man crept up to them through the shadows of the deck, faint light gleaming off the silk darts strapped to his wrists. The snake man twisted his mouth into a smile as he watched for the instant Gu Yuan was about to step inside the cabin. Seizing his chance, he launched 6 silk darts from both wrists at once, all hurtling straight for Gu Yuan. A black hawk swooped down with a screech. Chang'e instinctively threw himself forward to protect Gu Yuan, but the sensation of the ocean breeze cleaved by sharp blades reached Gu Yuan's skin first. He pulled Chang'e to him and yanked both of them a few steps aside. The Dongying sword in his hands whipped up in an arc. 3 silk darts struck the blade, shattering it into 3 broken shards. Gu Yuan tossed it away, sleeves flying, and rolled nimbly to the side with Chang'e in his arms. The silk darts sliced through the dark cloth, tying up his hair, as the Black Hawk's arrow killed the snake man in a single blow. Gu Yuan didn't take this minor interruption to heart. He patted Chang'e and calmly said, "Just a little loose end. No matter." He reached for Chang'e's shoulder to push him to his feet, only for his legs to buckle beneath him. Scared out of his wits, Chang'e caught Gu Yuan in his arms. His hand accidentally brushed Gu Yuan's back, only to find that the man felt like he had just been fished out of the water. The clothes on his back were soaked through with cold sweat. Chapter 35. Troubled Heart. Guyuan deliberately slowed his breath, but at the end of each exhale, his body was overtaken by tremors. When he had been standing straight as a rod, no one could tell, but in Changgung's arms, it was as if the overwhelming pain was about to explode from his body. Guyuan panted lightly for a moment, and after a nearly indiscernible grimace, looked up at Changgung with a crooked, haphazard smile and spat out a load of nonsense. It's okay. It was just one Dongying ninja. There. I'll pet your hair. Don't be scared. Stop squeezing me so tight. Seeing him like this, Changgung was torn between heartache and a strong desire to beat him to death. Using the long scabbard of the Dongying sword for support, Guyuan struggled to his feet again, every single blue vein popping from his deathly pale hands like they were about to burst through the skin. Guyuan had been able to tell with a careful sniff that Chen Xingqu had mixed his usual medicine into the bowl of wine she offered. After weighing his options of deaf and blind or splitting headache but able to see, he had quickly chosen the latter. The truth was, Guyuan wouldn't have been majorly impeded even if he didn't drink it. After all, he couldn't have known ahead of time that the Linyuan Pavilion's musician just happened to be Miracle Dr. Chun's granddaughter. But when the bowl of medicine was right under his nose, he was unable to overcome the need for control that had been carved into his bones. Guyuan had to admit that Shunyi was right. He knew that one day he would have to make peace with his broken body, but knowing wasn't the same as doing. Even if he was capable of living enough without relying on his sight or hearing, any disability ceased to be an impairment once one became habituated to it. But to achieve such an end, the old Marquis had stolen away the most carefree days of his childhood. Even though things had changed over the years, perhaps he still held onto some lingering frustrations. But those frustrations would have to be slowly ground away by the passage of time. Over the bumpy course of his interactions with Changgung within the past few years, Guyuan's resentment toward the previous generation had already faded significantly. Although he would never be as strict with Changgung as the former Marquis had been with him, he had gradually begun to understand his fatherly intentions. Perhaps every resentment and grudge in the world would dissolve before the combined powers of forgetfulness and empathy. Through clenched teeth, Changgung said, "I won't." Not only did he not let go, he tightened his arm around Guyuan, sticking to him like glue as he helped Guyuan all the way into the cabin. Mystified, Guyuan asked, "Have you developed yet another way of acting spoiled?" "I must have been scared to death by that Dongying man," Changgung ground out in a sardonic retort. Guyuan had nothing to say to that. "Calm down," Changgung willed himself. "Just calm down a bit." He forced himself to breathe as he helped Guyuan take a seat in the ringleader's chair, shifting him into a comfortable position. Changgung examined Guyuan's complexion with a frown, and then asked in a whisper next to his ear, "Yifu, where does it hurt?" Guyuan knew he couldn't hide it this time, so flagrant shamelessness it was. He beckoned Changgung over. Changgung leaned in, face serious. "It's that time of the month," Guyuan said in a hushed voice. "My stomach is sore and bloated." Changgung didn't realize what he meant at first. Huh? What? Then it clicked, and his face went red with the whoosh. Out of embarrassment or rage, who could say? Guyuan's head hurt so badly he wanted to bash it into a wall, but Changgung's tender little face was just too adorable. Laughing through the pain, he reflected that pranks made quite an effective painkiller. Flame practically shot from Changgung's eyes as he glared at him in fury. Guyuan, who had years of practice offering a head pat after every tease, coughed and switched to a more serious tone. "I didn't have a chance to eat anything yet tonight, and Miss Chun gave me a bowl full of cold wine. My stomach hurts, but it's nothing serious." This sounded reasonable at first, but every soldier got used to going hungry while on the front lines. How could someone as tough as Marshal Gu have the face to pretend he was such a delicate flower? Every effort Changgung had expended to remain composed fizzled away like bubbles popping on the wind. On the verge of exploding in anger, he blurted out, "Gu Shiliu, you—" Even after stuttering out a whole string of "yous," he was unable to decide how to continue scolding him. Guyuan burst out laughing and patted Changgung's head. What? You grown now and subtly understand you should care about your Yifu? Looks like I haven't doted on you all these years for nothing. His palm was like the sky pressing down on Changgung's head, smothering his towering fires of rage and leaving nothing but an insignificant wisp of smoke, helpless and powerless before its own extinction. Who the hell would care for you? Changung thought to himself. Not a single honest word out of your mouth. And why should I bother worrying? It's not like you're going to keel over dead. But the sight of Guyuan in pain made his eyes hurt. Changgeng could control his words and his thoughts, but he had no control over the worry in his heart. He sulked to himself for a while, then sighed and circled around behind the grand chair. He placed his hands on Guyuan's temples and began to massage them methodically, face still gloomy from their argument. Seeing that Guyuan's shoulders were relaxed, Changgeng could tell it wasn't his chest or stomach that hurt. His arms and legs were also perfectly mobile, and anyway, a minor flesh wound on his limbs wouldn't leave him in this much pain. By process of elimination, it was most certainly a headache. Changgeng remembered this had happened once on their way from Yanhui town to the capital. As he continued his ministrations, Changgeng couldn't help but snipe. Yifu, last time you told me it was a migraine. Did you forget? Guyuan was silent. He had indeed forgotten. The lies he had told over the course of his lifetime were enough to fill an ocean, and if he'd bothered to remember every single one, his head would have no room left for anything else. My head hurts too. Isn't it all because I'm pouring out my entire heart and soul in service to Great Liang, exhausting myself and fretting to the point of illness? He said this without the slightest blush. Changgeng's temper fizzled out entirely out of sheer awe. Then Guyuan pulled out his finishing move, conking out. He closed his eyes and focused on enjoying Changgeng's services, regretting only that the situation hadn't been fully wrapped up outside, so he had to keep an ear out and couldn't actually fall asleep right then and there. At first, Changgeng was wholly focused on massaging Guyuan's acupoints, but as he continued, his gaze involuntarily landed on Guyuan's face. Once you got used to someone's face, it really didn't matter much whether they were good-looking or ugly. Even the monk's bewitching pretty face didn't seem much different to him than Uncle Wang's after he'd become accustomed to his presence. Not to mention, Uncle Wang had much better hygiene than that monk. Guyuan was the only exception. Guyuan hadn't put his hair back up after the Dongying man scattered it. It spread scandalously over his body like fallen flowers swirling away in flowing water. But with Guyuan's dissolute habits, he didn't care at all. After staring at him for far too long, all those dreams Changgeng had shoved deep in the back of his mind involuntarily floated to the surface as his thoughts began to run wild. The Wu-Argus stirring restlessly within his body wove an unspeakable dreamscape before his eyes. He saw himself bend down and kiss Guyuan's forehead, brow, nose, all the way down to his lips. Those lips surely wouldn't be very soft or very sweet. They would probably even be bitter, like the medicinal scent that never faded from his body. Or perhaps they would carry the fragrance of alcohol. Changgeng also very much wanted to bite him. As soon as this idea took form, he could also taste the faintly sweet tang of blood on his tongue, and his entire body began to tremble. Changgeng shivered violently, then snapped back to his senses. As he stood behind Guyuan's chair in a daze, he had bitten down on his own tongue. Changgeng realized his fingers were still hovering by Guyuan's ears and yanked them back as if burned. He stood there frozen for a moment, then called out quietly through unsteady breaths. Yifu? Guyuan was deep in his act of pretending to be asleep, so he did not open his eyes, and never saw that bloody gleam which had yet to leave Changgeng's. Changgeng gave him a deep look, picked up his sword, and fled from the cabin. Outside, the ocean wind whipped across the deck. Above, the Black Hawks on guard wheeled over the flagship, and below, the Jiangnan Navy was cleaning up the battlefield in an orderly fashion at Yao Zhen's command. The Dongying people, scattered after losing their leader, had jumped in the ocean to clamber into skiffs or swim away. The surrounding sea dragons cast hidden nets into the water and caught a whole school of them who swam right into their traps. The tied-up Huang Qiao had been personally escorted to Yao Zhen, who was not far away, and Yao Zhen was now bending down with a contemplative look to speak to him. Changgung's eyes skimmed over all these scenes, but he paid no mind to any of them. He let the burning heat on his face and body drift away in the ocean wind. That particular penetrating and damp chill of the ocean quietly burrowed its way into his marrow. Frozen to the bone, facing the great sea, Changgong said to himself, "You beast!" There was no way he could stay in the Marquis estate or at Guyuan's side any longer. 2 days later, the peach trees blossomed in Commissioner Yao's estate, enveloping the entire residence in fragrant mist. Guyuan sat at the window, munching on sunflower seeds as he waited for Yao Jun to pen a memorial to the emperor. An incident as major as this must of course be reported to the court. Once all the ringleaders had been named, there would be a lengthy investigation. Who knew how large the case would become, or how many major figures would be implicated? Perhaps a storm would be coming to the capital. Yao Jun set down his brush. The man looked like he hadn't slept in days. "My lord, how do you think we should go about reporting this?" "Just say the regional judiciary commissioner discovered something afoot at sea and secretly sent people to investigate, overturning their plot before the rebellion army could fully take shape." Guyuan replied absently. "No, no," Yao Jun hurriedly rebutted him. "I am a mere scholar. I get seasick if I step onto a dragon and airsick if I step onto a kite. I was throwing up the whole way over. How can I claim this great accomplishment for myself? It was all your doing, entering the enemy camp alone and pulling back the force of the tide." Guyuan smiled. "I was far away in the northwest. Could it be that I have the ability to appear anywhere in an instant? It was Commissioner Yao, who was quick and resourceful on the battlefield, who ordered his soldiers to don black armor to intimidate the rebel army and send them into a panic. What an admirable plan." "I'm not doing it," Yao Jun blurted out. "Don't trouble me like this, my lord." Commissioner Yao was 36, in the prime of a man's life. He had two spirited bunches of whiskers on his face and a clever and capable sort of mien. His career as an official had been full of ups and downs, yet he'd always refused to leave this fertile region. He accomplished absolutely nothing in his lifetime, though he had a wonderful talent for sleeping in for a whole day and night. As time went on, everyone forgot his origins. In the 12th year of Yuanhe, when Guyuan's teacher Lin Mosen was still living, this great scholar had been the head examiner of the imperial examination. Upon reading Yao Jun's essay, he slapped the desk and shouted in approval, and proceeded to present the essay to the Yuanhe emperor. Thus, Yao Jun, courtesy name Yao Chongzi, had been granted the title of Zhuangyuan, first place in the imperial examination, by the emperor's own hand. You don't want credit for an achievement as great as halting a rebellion in the East Sea, thereby preventing a great war which threatened the safety of the capital before it could even begin? Guyuan said meaningfully. A future in which you are considered as good a general as a minister is within reach, Commissioner Yao. Yao Jun snorted. "I'll only bite off as much as I can chew. I am a mere low-level official with neither talent nor virtue. I am content to tend to my corner of the world and live the rest of my life in comfort. I lack the ability to ride the wind and clouds. Please spare me." Guyuan shook his head. "And here I was planning to submit a memorial to the emperor and request you come to the northwest as army inspector." Yao Jun bowed down with his arms over his head. "I have an 80-year-old mother and young children crying to be fed. I beg this hero to spare my sorry life. If you see anything you like in my home, just go ahead and take it." Guyuan was at a loss for words. "How about this? Seeing as this happened in our jurisdiction, Governor Zhou of Liangjiang can't avoid getting involved. I'll go talk it over with him." Yao Jun began with a fawning smile. Registering the displeased look on Guyuan's face, he hastily added, That's right. There's also the little prince. His Highness was journeying through Jiangnan and stumbled across the rebel army, kidnapping military artificers and pressing them into service. Encountering injustice before his very eyes, he infiltrated the encampment on his own and coordinated with our army from inside, finally capturing their leader with his own hands. What do you think about that?" As soon as he heard this, Guyuan went silent in thought. Although the emperor wouldn't say it outright, he still had his reservations about Changgung's origins. Now, it looked like this incident would implicate Prince Wei, and the emperor was sure to be grievously disappointed. If he saw this youngest brother he'd heretofore ignored standing clear on his stride, perhaps he would be willing to set aside the grudges of the previous generation. Changgang was nearly of an age to be bestowed his own title of nobility. If he could count on the emperor's favor, perhaps he would have an easier road to walk in the future. Guyuan weighed his options, then shot Yao Zhen a glare. This person was truly talented. If not, he wouldn't have been able to maintain such a long friendship with the Marquis of Anding after a single meeting. But he was also truly unambitious. His pursuits consisted of lazing about, using his brains and talents to bribe superiors and subordinates alike, growing out his whiskers, and fawning over others. Yao Zhen smiled. "My lord, what do you think?" Guyuan waved him off, wrapped his outer robe around himself, and rose to leave. He planned to leave Jiangnan in secret. Both the Linyuan Pavilion and the Black Iron Battalion had been embroiled into this incident, but neither wanted to publicize their involvement. The fabrication of a sensible tale would be left to Yao Zhen's brush. As Guyuan stepped outside, he caught sight of Changgang carving a bamboo flute in the courtyard. Ge Pengxiao, Cao Nyangzi, and Yao Zhen's two young daughters surrounded him. With patient and clever hands, Changgang carved two little bamboo flutes, each a quite legitimate-looking instrument. The girls, no more than 7 or 8 years old, hopped and skipped in circles around him. Just seeing him lifted Guyuan's spirits. Although he never said as much aloud, he had always hoped Changgang would grow into someone who was keen but didn't flaunt his sharpness. Someone who was righteous and kind, but not weak and irresolute. He hoped for him to be neither as cowardly as his father, nor as radical as his mother. Changgang had grown into exactly the person he had imagined without any intentional interference on his part. Even in appearance, he had inherited the best features of both his parents. Guyuan strolled over and plucked a freshly carved flute from Changgang's hands with a grin. "Do I get one too?" Changgang's relaxed smile froze on his face. He took the flute back and handed it to one of the little girls staring at him in eager expectation. "It's just a child's toy, only a rough and simple thing. Yifu mustn't make fun of me." Guyuan stood speechless. He stared silently at the little girl's flute and thought to himself, but I want one too. The child, whose head didn't even reach Guyuan's waist, clutched the flute in her hands and shoved them behind her back, fearlessly staring up into Marshal Gu's eyes. Changgang set aside his tools and signaled for Ge Pengxiao and Cao Nyangzi to keep the little girls amused. He followed Guyuan and after settling his thoughts, asked, "Is Yifu planning to return to the northwest?" Guyuan nodded, in low spirits. You'll go back and have an audience with the emperor on my behalf. Chongzi will tell you what to say. Don't worry." Changgang made a quiet noise of assent. "You have performed a meritorious deed this time. The emperor may reward you," Guyuan continued. "It's possible he'll allow you to attend court early. If you raise the matter, he may even allow you to join me in the northwest." When they had met again this year, Changgang had already become an adult who could keep calm in the face of peril. His childish airs had disappeared, and Guyuan's resolve to never bring him to the northwest had loosened. Now that the northwest enjoyed some approximation of peace, Guyuan calculated that he could bring Changgang to the front lines to gain some experience. It wasn't like he needed to do anything while he was there, and any achievements would be counted in his favor when he returned to the court. When Guyuan left home, Changgang had been so determined to follow him to the northwest. Guyuan thought he would be overjoyed to have his wishes fulfilled now, but Changgang only quietly paused mid-stride. After a moment of silence, he said, "Yifu, I no longer wish to go to the western regions." Chapter 36. Separation. This ran entirely counter to his expectations. Startled, Guyuan blurted out, "Why?" Changgang's answer was well-reasoned and logical. "Yifu's Black Iron Battalion is managing the situation in the western regions. If I go, I could only be a nuisance. What's more, I would be troubling you to take pains to hand me some specious military achievements. There wouldn't be much meaning to the whole affair." Though this analysis generally matched Guyuan's own thinking, hearing Changgang pointed out to his face still felt like a bucket of cold water dumped over his head. Barely managing to master his expression, Guyuan said, "Then That's good too. You can also return to the capital and begin attending court early. My teacher has some students there. You could get acquainted with them now. Isn't that just the same? As Chang'eng spoke, he looked toward the end of the covered walkway. The splendid sun of Jiangnan was dipping toward the horizon, setting all the spring flowers in the courtyard ablaze. He had heard from the servants in the Yao estate that although these flowers were beautiful, they only bloomed for 10 days to a half month and would wither not long after blossoming. And these were the ones carefully tended in the garden. If they blossomed in the deserted wilderness, they would quietly bloom, then quietly wither. The span of their lives a mere instant in the lifespan of the world. Perhaps a few wild birds and dumb beasts would pass by, but who would be there to observe their beauty? Flowers were like this. By and large, all the meaningless love and hatred within a human heart must be like this as well. Yifu, continued Jianggang, Great Master Liao Zhen knows many unique and talented people. I want to travel the world with them. Of course, I won't let it disrupt my studies and training. Before he had finished, Gu Yuan's expression darkened and he interrupted. No. Chang'eng turned back to face him, gazing at him in silence. In the shadow cast by the sun setting behind him, something inexplicable swirled in the young man's eyes. Gu Yuan had never noticed it before, and seeing it now, he felt his heart begin to palpitate with unease. He realized he had been a bit harsh and hastily relaxed his expression before continuing. I don't mind if you go out to play. After you return to the capital, have Uncle Wang assign a few guards from the estate to accompany you around. But I have one rule. You mustn't go anywhere that doesn't have an imperial relay station, and you must send a letter assuring me of your safety at every relay station you come across. And go everywhere dressed finely and eating well, preening wherever I go, Chang'eng said flatly. In that case, I might as well go to the National Temple whenever I'm bored to join the madams and young ladies burning incense. At least that way you won't waste your money feeding all those people and horses. Gu Yuan was struck dumb. This kid has learned how to talk back, and talk back with elegance, composure, and nasty hidden barbs at that. The good mood coaxed out of Gu Yuan by the fine spring scenery of Jiangnan evaporated without a trace. And now I can't even get through to him. Have I spoiled him so much that he's totally out of control? The roads to the Jiangqiu are long, and human hearts are treacherous. What's so fun about that? Impatience began to creep into his tone. That monk hasn't done an honest day of work in his life, and his only skills are begging and running for his life. If something happens to you on the road, how will I explain myself to the late emperor? Ah, Chang'eng thought coldly to himself. So it's all because you need to explain yourself to the late emperor. Well, if the late emperor found out from beneath the 9 springs that I'm a little mongrel Xuniang dug up from who knows where to muddy the imperial bloodline, maybe he'd be furious enough to return to the living just to strangle me to death. Every glance at Gu Yuan was another knife to the heart, another addition to his list of sins. He wished he could flee in shame that very instant, but this man wouldn't let him go. Chang'eng stared at the hopelessly clueless Gu Yuan, and, for just a moment, a lingering and baseless resentment rose within his heart. But he quickly came to his senses. Chang'eng pulled his gaze away from Gu Yuan and said evenly, Just a few days ago, Yifu told me you would support me no matter what, as long as I was certain of the road I wish to walk. Are you going back on your word so soon? I said you have to think it through. Chang'eng's temper began to flare. Is that what you were calling thinking it through? This is exactly what I want to do, Chang'eng said seriously. I won't allow it. Think again. Come find me once you're done. Gu Yuan didn't want to lecture him out in the open, so he huffily turned and left with a flick of his sleeves. Chang'eng swept away the flower petals that had landed on his shoulders as he watched Gu Yuan's retreating figure. Hearing footsteps from behind, he identified the newcomer without even turning his head. Great Master Liao Zhen, I apologize for the spectacle. Liao Zhen had been afraid to come out earlier and hung back, eavesdropping for a while, until he saw Gu Yuan leave. Only then did he feel safe to show himself. Trying to smooth things over, he signed. The Marquis only wants what's best for you. Chang'eng looked down at his hands. They were now covered in a thin layer of calluses, but had yet to be weathered by scars. I don't want to live according to what he thinks best and become useless trash who must rely on him for everything. Your Highness, I believe you are being rather unfair. Liao Zhan signed. Even the sages grew up under their parents' and elders' protection when they were young. By your standards, isn't everyone in the world useless trash? Great devices take longer to construct. You must avoid arrogance and impatience. Chang'Gong said nothing. Clearly, he hadn't taken these words to heart. Liao Zhan continued. I see you are dispirited. This poison must have sunk down to the bone. Chang'Gong flinched. For a second, he thought Liao Zhan had found out about the Wu Ge, but Liao Zhan continued. Every person has a poison in their hearts. Some are more severe than others. But at your age, it ought not have overtaken you so completely. Your heart is too heavy with worries. Chang'Gong laughed bitterly. What do you know? Ever since that day in Yanhui town, Chang'Gong had felt that everything around him, his princely title, his false reputation, even Gu Yuan, were things stolen from him by Xunyang. One day, someone would see that he was an ill match for these things, and his true nature would be revealed. He would lose everything. Gripped by such endless and extreme terror, Chang'Gong felt like an external outsider in the capital. Gu Yuan had plotted out his future prospects as the fourth prince, but to Chang'Gong, not a word of it felt real. When he looked in the mirror each day, he knew he was an earthworm writhing in the muck. Yet everyone else insisted on sticking horns on his head and pasting scales to his body, going to every effort to dress this sinuous little creature up as an imperial dragon. But no matter how many ornaments they placed on him, he still looked nothing like the real thing and would always be only an uncouth worm. He might as well spare himself some embarrassment in the future and stay far away from it all. Gu Yuan was the only one who brought him such vivid joys and sorrows without an ounce of artifice. He would be lying to himself if he said he could put aside this relationship so lightly, yet he often found himself feeling unworthy of it. Chang'Gong didn't spend long wallowing in self-pity. He gathered himself and said, That's right, I wanted to talk to you. What illness does my little Yifu actually have? He acted very oddly on our trip to the East Sea, but he refuses to tell me anything. The monk shook his head. Amitabha Buddha, I dare not say. Chang'Gong furrowed his brow. He goes around acting like he's invincible, and now you're helping him? Is the Marquis someone who feigns invincibility for no reason? Liao Zhan smiled. If he's unwilling to mention it himself, it's not because he's afraid others will know his weaknesses. It's likely because this is his sore spot and the poison in his heart. And who would dare poke the Marquis of Anding in his sore spot? Your Highness, please spare my meager life. Chang'Gong frowned in contemplation. Having managed to sneak away from the desert for a few days, Gu Yuan had planned to enjoy the scenery in Jiangnan. He thought he might go out and ride some horses, swim in some lakes, and admire some beauties, to have his fill of fun before he left. But Chang'Gong's word killed his mood, and he ended up holding himself up in his room. Looking at Chang'Gong infuriated him, and looking at Yao Zhen made him mad too. Looking at Liao Zhen especially left him in a furious rage. Yao Zhen's two unruly kids trilled on their flutes one after another without cease, like a pair of chatty starlings, loud enough to be heard in the villages from miles around. The tuneless sound made Gu Yuan remember how Chang'Gong had plucked that flute right out of his hand, and that thought made him even angrier. Didn't Chang'Gong used to give anything he had to his godfather first? Why the sudden change of heart? It was a pity that, although parents and children ought to be connected in fate through the blood they shared, the connection was in no way eternal. And when the child in question wasn't even related by blood, what did they have left to hold them together? That evening, a Black Hawk landed in Gu Yuan's courtyard. Sir, a letter from General Shen. Gu Yuan sucked down his irritation and accepted the missive from the soldier, only to see that the chatterbox Shen Yi had written quite a concise letter. It contained only 3 words. Emergency. Return post haste. Since leaving the Lingshu Institute, Shen Yi had braved countless perils at Gu Yuan's side. What danger hadn't he encountered? He would never irritate Gu Yuan by writing a letter to rush him like this unless it was serious. Sir, how should we... I understand. No need to reply. We set out at first light. He hadn't gotten through to Chang'Gong at all. Gu Yuan had planned to give him the cold shoulder for a few days before broaching the topic again. But Shen Yi's urgent message gave him no choice. After pacing a few circles around his room, he got up to go find him. Changung was practicing with his sword in the courtyard. Guyuan watched for a while, then suddenly drew the sword at the waist of the Black Hawk who had been accompanying him. The Black Hawk hadn't removed his armor, and the heavy sword was as wide as a man's palm. Guyuan lifted it as easily as if it were a feather duster. Changung, on guard! Before the challenge was out of his mouth, he had already lunged with the sword. Changung caught the blow steadily, without retreating a single step. He's improved, Guyuan thought, and he has some strength in his arms now. He flexed his arms and pushed off Changgung's sword, launching himself into a flip and swinging his blade in a great arc like the full moon. Changung didn't dare take this blow head-on and darted to the side, yet found himself unable to divert the momentum of his blade. In Guyuan's hand, that clumsy sword became as agile as a snake's tongue, making 3 thrusts in quick succession. Changung held his sword up across his chest to block, but he had already been backed into the corner of the courtyard. Turning aside, he darted up the column and twisted in mid-air, landing atop Guyuan's sword with one foot. Guyuan cheered him for the move, then dropped the sword hilt. Having lost his footing, Changung tumbled. Guyuan snatched the hilt back up and angled the blade down, pressing it against the young man's shoulder as he struggled to rise. A layer of gooseflesh rose on Changgung's neck from the gleam of the black iron. Smiling, Guyuan patted Changgung's shoulder with the flat of the sword, then tossed it back to the Black Hawk behind him. Not bad. You haven't been slacking in your training. Changung rotated his slightly numb wrist. I'm still far behind Yifu. Without an ounce of shame, Guyuan said, of course you're still far behind me. Changung stared at him in exasperation. Shouldn't any normal person first say a few modest words, then give him some earnest pointers? Why'd he just take it and run with it? Changung had never seen such an immodest godfather. If you come to the northwestern camp, Guyuan continued, you could receive my personal instruction. So, it was back to this. Changung couldn't help it. He burst out laughing. It was a strange thing, but when he really wanted something, desperate longing and every sort of tactic would still fail to bring it to you. Then, when you no longer wanted it, it would come banging at your door. Changgung's refusal was polite. When I was living in the Marquis estate, I once asked my Shifu how Yifu became so skilled if he also completed all his martial training within the estate when he was younger. Shifu told me that the strength of one's skills depends on how much effort one is willing to put in. With enough effort and enough experience dancing with death on the battlefield, it doesn't matter who taught you. Guyuan's smile faded. Yifu, I've thought it through, and I still want to go out and see the world. Guyuan frowned. Are the capital and the border not part of the world? What else do you want to see? Is Great Liang not enough to contain you? Do you wish to journey all the way to the far west? Ugh, for crying out loud, this father-son pair were at it again. Standing behind them, the Black Hawk didn't dare make a sound. This mighty aerial killer hugged his sword, pretending he was a pile of coal someone forgot to put away. Changung fell silent, looking intensely at Guyuan. For a split second, he very much wanted to retch up everything he had shoved down into his heart right here in this courtyard. But he resisted the urge. When he imagined what Guyuan's reaction might be, he concluded he might not be able to bear it. Don't say another word, Guyuan said coldly. I don't want to know where these bizarre ideas of yours came from. I'm telling that monk to beat it tomorrow, and you're going back to the capital. If you don't want to come to the northwest, then just stay at home. Don't move a millimeter. Changung wanted to scream at Guyuan. The Marquis estate isn't my home! But as soon as these words reached his lips, he bit them in half and swallowed them back down. He was instinctively afraid that these words would wound Guyuan's heart, even if he didn't know whether Guyuan had a heart to wound. Yifu, Changung said quietly, I've put you through a lot of trouble by making you rush here from the northwest. I can't be sorry enough. But if you refuse to listen to reason, I can only be obstinate in response. If I could run once, I can run again. You can't watch me forever, and the guards at the estate can't stop me. Guyuan was insensible with rage. The Marquis estate had always been his refuge. No matter how little he wanted to return to the capital, the thought of going home always gave him one thing to look forward to. Only now did he comprehend that, to Changung, this place was like a prison. Try me, he ground out. The two parted in discord once again. The Black Hawk chased after Guyuan. He hadn't gotten very far, and uncaring of whether Chang'e was still within earshot, he ordered tersely, "You needn't follow me back to the northwest tomorrow. Return to the capital with the fourth prince, and don't let him take a single step outside the city walls." "Yes, sir." The fire raging at these city gates not only brought calamity upon the innocent fish in the moat below, it even scorched the Black Hawk flying past into a bald chicken. What an unexpected disaster. Early the next morning, Guyuan left, still in a huff. He didn't go to see Chang'e again. On his way out, the devious Marquis of Anding snuck undetected into the courtyard occupied by Commissioner Yao's young daughters and stole the bamboo flute the little girl had left on the swing. When the child woke and found that the flute had disappeared, she sobbed for an entire day in anguish. Guyuan rushed back even faster than he'd left, and the first thing he said to Shunyi upon landing was, "Prepare my medicine." Shunyi's expression was solemn. "Can you still hear?" "I can," said Guyuan, "but my ears are going. If you have something to say, make it quick." Shunyi pulled a few sheets of paper from his lapels. "This is the Desert Scorpion's personal testimony. I haven't shown it to anyone else. I performed the interrogation myself. I was waiting for your return to make the final call." Guyuan skimmed the pages at top speed as he walked. Suddenly, his steps paused, and he folded the papers in his hands. In that moment, his expression was a bit frightening. The Desert Scorpion had only raided the Silk Road because the opportunity presented itself. His true objective was Lolan. The leader of the Desert Raiders supposedly possessed a treasure map of Lolan, and the so-called treasure was a 1,000-hectare violet gold mine. Shunyi lowered his voice. "Sir, the implications of this are great. Do we report it to the court?" "No," replied Guyuan immediately. Rapidly turning the situation over in his head, he asked, "Where is this map?" "The Desert Scorpion tattooed it on his own stomach," revealed Shunyi at a volume only the two of them could hear. "He didn't say where he got it from?" "It was stolen," Shunyi said. "These desert raiders are arrogant and fearless. Central Plains people, residents of all the western region countries, far westerners, they rob everyone they meet, and they themselves don't even know which pile of loot the map came from." Guyuan mouthed an understanding "oh," squinted his eyes, which were beginning to go blurry, and gazed out at the rich splendor of Lolan's lights glowing in the distance. A young Lolan boy was watching him from afar and, as if excited to have an audience, began to play his single-stringed zither from the perch on the city wall, beaming in Guyuan's direction. Guyuan had no time to play with these Lolan people who knew nothing but drink and leisure. He looked away and stuffed those folded up pieces of paper back into Shunyi's hands. "Silence him." Shunyi's pupils contracted slightly. "Silence him, destroy the body, and erase all the traces." Guyuan's lips scarcely moved. All his words held between his teeth. "The rest of the desert raiders, too. Just say the vicious raiders attempted to break out, and our soldiers had no choice but to slay them. This stays between you and me, so you'll be the only suspect if anything leaks. Now go and investigate the origins of that treasure map immediately." "Yes, sir." After a pause, Shunyi spoke up again. "Sir, there's been a rumor from the capital. Prince Wei has been placed under house arrest." Guyuan shot him a look. "As you said, a rumor. Until we see an imperial edict, don't make random guesses. Go do your job." Shunyi made a sound of assent. Guyuan stood in place and massaged the corner of his eyes, fatigue clear on his face. He hoped he was overreacting to the news of this mysterious treasure map. The dragon threat in the East Sea had yet to be put down, and now more trouble was appearing in the northwest. He had an unfortunate nagging suspicion. This was no coincidence. Half a month later, two memorials from Jiangnan arrived before the Longan Emperor, Li Feng. Li Feng tapped on his desk. A man in his 40s with a flowing beard was waiting beside him, and he quickly stepped up to adjust his gas lamp brighter. This person was the emperor's maternal uncle, Wang Guo, the most favored official in the imperial court. Li Feng unfolded the first memorial. It contained the story Yao Zhen had arranged with Guyuan. It erased the role of the Black Iron Battalion and the Linyuan Pavilion, flattered every single official in Jiangnan from top to bottom, and praised everyone's merits to the skies. After reading it, the emperor said nothing. He picked up the second memorial. This was a secret memorial, containing a story entirely different from the first. It said, on the day of the engagement, the Marquis of Anding and several dozen Black Hawks and Black Carapaces appeared in the East Sea. They captured the ringleader. According to his testimony, there was a woman on the rebel army's sea dragon whose behavior was strange. She is suspected to be of the Linyuan pavilion and an old acquaintance of Gu Yun. Li Feng read this report, too, in silence. He passed the two memorials to Wang Guo. Imperial Uncle Wang rapidly skimmed through both, then carefully examined Li Feng's turbulent expression, attempting to read his sovereign's intentions before speaking. This, Your Majesty, although the Marquis of Anding's involvement amounted to a merit and no harm, abandoning his post without leave is... His Black Hawks can fly 1,000 kilometers a day, Li Feng said slowly, and crossing the Central Plains is no more than a few days' journey. Although he abandoned his post without leave, he has not gone too far out of line. Yet we do not understand how such a coincidence occurred. What role, exactly, did the Marquis of Anding play in this affair? Wang Guo's eyelids twitched as he came to a realization. Li Feng's slender fingers drummed on the table. Then there is the Linyuan Pavilion. This organization disappeared into the Jianghu for years, so why have they suddenly resurfaced? And when did Gu Yun make contact with these people? The Linyuan Pavilion was invisible in prosperous times. Their appearance signified impending chaos. Wang Guo sucked in a deep breath. Is His Majesty saying Gu Yun harbors traitorous... Li Feng cast him a sidelong glance. What are you thinking? He said with a faint smile. Uncle Shirliu grew up with us since our youth and has performed a great service in putting down this rebellion. Won't such a line of thought disillusion our loyal subjects? Wang Guo didn't understand what he meant. He could only nod in agreement, not daring to add anything further. However, our imperial uncle must surely be exhausted from bearing the weight of the entirety of Great Liang and all 4 of its borders on his shoulders alone. Don't you think it's high time we found some others to share his burden? All right, everyone. So that concludes the reading of Stars of Chaos, Volume 1, also known as Sha Po Lang by Priest. You guys, I have to say, from how I felt from the first 4 or 5 chapters to how I feel after everything else, all the way to the end of this book, I'm very excited to see where this story takes place. I'm really loving this whole steampunk thing going on. I only have 2 things, or maybe 3, that I want to say about the last few chapters. Number 1 is the fact that Cao Nyangzi, Ge Pengxiao, and Chang'eng were able to proficiently learn so much freaking sign language in 1 year's time. It's absolutely amazing. And I know it's not impossible because I've seen videos of lots of people who are able to learn a lot of one language in 1 year. So it's not impossible, but for people who are like that, I know that it takes extreme dedication. So just knowing that they did that is absolutely amazing. And then I think it's so hilarious that Gu Yun told Chang'eng he could go with him after, he went back to the capital and got merits and whatnot. And Gu Yun was like, nah, I don't want to do that anymore. I just found it hilarious because it's clear that Gu Yun misses his godson and he actually wants to see him, but now he feels like Chang'eng doesn't want anything to do with him. It's so funny. And seeing them get in their little argument or whatever twice, very interesting. Very, very interesting indeed. So we can only see what happens from there. And I wonder exactly who these people are that the emperor plans on sending to, quote unquote, assist Gu Yun. We'll see. But of course, I'm wondering, is it going to just be Chang'eng and Ge Pengxiao and Cao Nyangzi and some other people, of course, maybe. But I feel like he might send them. So anyway, congratulations. You have finished with me the very first volume of Sha Po Lang, and next time we meet, it will be Arc 2. I'm sorry, not Arc 2, but Volume 2. Arc 5. 我爱你们